Mr. Speaker, the response to the annual budget address by the Leader of the Opposition is one of the most eagerly anticipated events in the parliamentary calendar. I have been told that I am the first female Leader of the Opposition in 44 years to respond to a budget. The last woman to do so was Dominica's first female lawyer, Dame Mary Eugenia Charles. Ms. Charles went on to become the first Prime Minister the following year after the July 21st, 1980 general elections. Mr. Speaker, it is truly humbling to be in this such illustrious company. Mr. Speaker, if history does repeat itself, as to so often does, then the village of Salisbury would come sometime have its first female Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, while I am honored to be standing here as the Leader of the Opposition, responding to the budget, I do so with storm cloud gathering over our country and against the backdrop of an economy in free fall. Mr. Speaker, this budget falls woefully short of what is required to resuscitate the moribund economy. The theme of this year's budget, resetting to ensure the judicious use of government's limited resources, is an indication that this government is intellectually bankrupt. After 23 years in power, they are stale and have clearly run out of road. No amount of resetting can make this government fresh and bristling with ideas. Mr. Speaker, the present economic situation in Dominica is dire. The economy has come to a complete stop. Our capital city, Roseau, once buzzing with locals and tourists, is now largely deserted except for Montford. Supermarkets in Roseau no longer have long lines. People shop with baskets, not only trolleys. Shops in Portsmouth and in the villages are struggling. Bakeries are now extending credit to customers by the 10th of the month. The only thriving private sector businesses now are the funeral homes. Mr. Speaker, Dominicans are unable to meet their basic needs. With food prices rising daily, rampant inflation has reduced drastically the purchasing power of our citizens. Dominicans are now experiencing poverty they never thought they would have experienced in their lifetime. The private sector is feeling the squeeze. The government itself is experiencing such cash flow pressures and is having difficulty in meeting its commitment to public servants, the private sector, contractors, the Dominica State College, the Dominica State Prison, the Dominica China Friendship Hospital in a timely manner. But while the economy is in dire straits, just 7 months ago, Roosevelt Skerrit, Prime Minister, appointed the largest cabinet in the history of our country. He has also added to the wage bill by bringing back Honorable Reginald Austrin, Honorable Kenneth Darrow, and Rosalind Paul, amongst others. Among the nations of the Commonwealth, Dominica is in the unique position where close to 90% of the members of the Parliament are also members of the Cabinet. Mr. Speaker, all the signs are the economy is heading for a crash. Desperate to shore up the public finances, the government has decided to make a raid on credit unions and to increase the fees to obtain marriage and birth certificates. It seems inevitable now that Dominica will, sooner rather than later, have to engage the lender of last resort, the International Monetary Fund, to deal with the massive economic adjustments that will be necessary. Mr. Speaker, I am here in this Parliament. Indeed, all of us on this side of the House are here because of the repeated failure of this government to implement genuine and fundamental electoral reform. Recommendations from the Organization of American States, the Commonwealth, CARICOM, have been ignored over the last 15 years by the Skerrit administration. However, the Prime Minister gave a commitment to Dominicans after the 2019 general elections that he would implement electoral reform within 100 days of the election. In 2020, the Prime Minister appointed a sole commissioner, a former president of the Caribbean Court of Justice, Sir Dennis Byron, to look at Dominica's electoral laws, systems, and processes to advise on the way forward as to the future conduct of elections in Dominica. Mr. Speaker, I don't want to be drawn into a long debate about the legality of Sir Dennis Byron's appointment. The view of the parliamentary opposition is that the leader of a political party, the DLP, with a stake in the outcome of any proposals on electoral reform, it was the Electoral Commission and not the Prime Minister that should have engaged in Sir Dennis or any other consultant, for that matter, on electoral reform. Further, for an expenditure of that amount, other bids ought to have been sought before a final contract was awarded. Mr. Speaker, a major concern that I have was the decision of the Prime Minister to call a general election before Sir Dennis Byron had submitted his proposals on electoral reform. By calling an election before the publication of the report by Sir Dennis, the question must be asked whether the Prime Minister was acting in good faith when he engaged Sir Dennis Byron in the first place. And what was even more shocking was the decision of Sir Dennis Byron not to say a word on the Prime Minister's decision to call the election. Mr. Speaker, what was even more surprising was the decision of Sir Dennis to continue his $450,000 electoral reform consultancy, despite the fact that Roosevelt Skerrit had called an election before he had a chance to submit his report. Mr. Speaker, Sir Dennis Byron finally submitted his electoral reform report to the Prime Minister.
Member, Honorable,
Yes.
Honorable, the Prime Minister, but proceed. I don't want to
Yes.
affect
Sorry.
your flow. So,
Sorry.
but remember that.
Sorry.
But Honorable.
Mr. Speaker, Sir Dennis Byron finally submitted his electoral reform report to the Prime Minister in June 2023. Having waited for 3 years for this report, and with the taxpayers Dominica's $450,000 poorer, we on this side of the House have serious misgivings about the report. Mr. Speaker, this report by Sir Dennis Byron has come to an important juncture in our country's history. On November 3rd, 2023, we will have achieved an important milestone in our country's history, that of the 45th anniversary of our independence from Britain. Normally, Mr. Speaker, this would be a cause for great celebration, an association where we reflect on the momentous achievements of our post-colonial existence. Sadly, Mr. Speaker, the advent of Sir Dennis Byron reports concerning electoral reform throws a dark cloud across the landscape of our beautiful island. Mr. Speaker, the proposed reforms, far from strengthening our democracy and rule of law, will do quite the opposite. It will make it virtually impossible for the voters who are ordinarily resident to our country to change their government through the ballot. For that reason, Mr. Speaker, and many other reasons, we are in parliamentary opposition cannot support key aspects of Sir Dennis Byron's proposals, which have been prepared at the behest of the Prime Minister and not the Electoral Reform Commission. Mr. Speaker, I will now outline in detail the concerns of the parliamentary opposition of the reports by Sir Dennis Byron, and our firm belief that this report, if implemented in full and not substantially changed, poses a fundamental threat to our already fledgling democracy. 1. It does not ensure the cleansing of the voters' list of those persons who have been resident overseas for more than 5 years, as our law stipulates. 2. It does not provide any meaningful campaign finance reform, given that the government-controlled Electoral Commission can increase the amount of election campaign spending during an election campaign. 3. It imposes no limits on spendings before an election is called by the Prime Minister. 4. It patently fails to provide for the need of voter identification cards with biometric data that would be an effective way to counter voter fraud. Rather, it provides for national identification cards which would not guarantee that persons holding such cards are eligible to vote. It fails to guarantee that all opposition parties have full access to both private and public media, as in the case in Antigua. While it proposes certain monetary and custodial penalties for violating Dominica's electoral laws, it fails to propose the additional penalty of having those convicted of violating Dominica's electoral laws. It stops short of providing the additional penalty of disqualifying any person convicted of such offenses of contesting elections in the future. It provides a formula for Dominicans abroad who visit Dominica for a certain period of time over a 5-year period to be considered residents in Dominica, thus making them eligible to vote. It provides for the registration of voters overseas, thereby opening the door for the cynical manipulation of this process to ensure that mainly supporters of the Labour Party government are registered. Despite the blatant and egregious importing of Dominicans abroad for the sole purpose of voting for the incumbent in 2009, 2014, and 2019, the Byron report fails miserably to specifically state that doing so constitutes bribery. Mr. Speaker, the people of Dominica are profoundly disappointed by the Wednesday, July 19, 2023 announcement by the United Kingdom's Home Secretary, Honorable Suella Braverman, that effective that very day, citizens of the Commonwealth of Dominica, along with the citizens of Honduras, Vanuatu, Namibia, and East Timor, will need to apply for the visa to travel to the United Kingdom. The British Home Secretary attributed the government's decision to introduce a visa requirement for citizens of the Commonwealth of Dominica and Vanuatu as directly linked to British concerns over their citizenship by investment programs. Mr. Speaker, in her remarks to the House of Commons, Honorable Braverman commented, and I quote, "Careful considerations of Dominica and Vanuatu operation of the Citizen by Investment Scheme has shown clear and evident abuse of the scheme, including the granting of citizenship to individuals known to pose a risk to the UK," end of quote. Mr. Speaker, the UK's government's justification for the immediate imposition of a visa requirement for citizens of the Commonwealth of Dominica wishing to travel to the United Kingdom is indeed a daunting indictment for the manner of which the CBI program of the manner in which the CBI program has been managed by the Prime Minister's Roosevelt Skerrit-led government over the last 15 years. Mr. Speaker, I listened carefully to the statement of the Prime Minister in an address to the nation made hours after the UK government policy change, in which he attempted to respond to the shocking indictment of his government's CBI program by the British government. Mr. Speaker, permit me to highlight parts of the Prime Minister's address, and I quote, "The decision on the British government is unfortunate and it hurts, but it shall not be a permanent harm. We will increase our efforts in showcasing our robust due diligence and risk mitigation efforts on all fronts. Dominica has the most proactive and robust due diligence processes, which vets anyone who wants to attain a Dominican passport. The vetting process is multi-layered and handled by top-rated due diligence agencies based in the UK and in the USA. Dominica has taken the lead in this region in seeking regional coordination in the various CBO programs and in discussing ways to safeguard all these programs. Our nation implemented 6 CBI principles proposed by the United States, including the implementation of mandatory reviews for applicants 16 years and older and for applicants of the CBI program. We will continue to evolve the due diligence process, as we are already doing, to ensure they do not only meet international standards, but alleviate any security concerns. Dominica has now a fresh impetus to go back and relook where it can do even better in terms of its CBI program in order to give its international partners confidence in its security measures, which, according to him, is already the most robust in the world. As a matter of fact, we shall engage the services of the European-based entity, who shall come in and do a comprehensive review of our entire program, and so advise us on any additional changes which we ought to make. We will continue to engage the United Kingdom on the matter as we will do on other nations, like those of the European Union and the United States of America." End of quote. Mr. Speaker, I must say, these are very interesting reflections by the Prime Minister on this very disappointing outcome of his government's lackluster stewardship of the largest income earning source for the Commonwealth of Dominica for close to a decade, the Citizen by Investment Program. Mr. Speaker, all the elements of his speech, which I have quoted, point to the disappointment of our Prime Minister and underscores his acceptance that there are still major deficiencies in the management of the program. Mr. Speaker, let me first underscore the major reason the British government gave for their change in policy towards Dominica. First, clear and evident abuse of the scheme. And second, granting of citizenship to individuals known to pose a risk to the United Kingdom. Mr. Speaker, it has been clear to Dominicans at home and abroad that for more than a decade that abuses of the CBI program have become a major problem, especially for the UK and the EU. Mr. Speaker, our government has yet to produce information to this honorable House and the Dominican population at large the requisite accounting of CBI revenues. Most significant is the failure of this Labour Party government to tell our people the cumulative number of citizens to date, specifically the number of persons who have become economic citizens under the watch of this Roosevelt-Skerrit administration. Mr. Speaker, secondly, this government has not provided a full accounting of all the revenues obtained under the CBI. We have come to the realization that the consolidated fund is not reflecting in a timely manner the total earnings of the number of persons granted economic citizenship. Mr. Speaker, even the most pessimistic estimates point to several billions of dollars of CBI revenues in accounts outside of Dominica. Where is the transparency with respect to the CBI funds? Mr. Speaker, I want to remind the Prime Minister that he wrote in his party's 2005 election manifesto, and I quote, "My friends, we now live in a world in which leadership, be it that of a corporation or a country, is being called to the highest standards of honesty, integrity, and accountability. You have heard of Enron and the WorldCom, massive US corporations and that employ thousands of people and controlled billions of dollars. In spite of impressive balance sheets, the companies collapsed because of leadership that was greedy, dishonest, and lacking integrity. The same can happen to a country. On becoming Prime Minister, I promise you leadership that was honest, upright. This is what I have been giving you and will continue to give you." Close quote. So, member for the Vickers and for the Vickers constituency and Prime Minister, live up to your undertaking you gave in 2005, and let's see transparency with respect to the billions of dollars in CBI revenue that is out there somewhere. Mr. Speaker, we in the parliamentary opposition are not all that surprised of the imposition of a UK visa requirement for Dominican citizens. Two developments in 2022 gave us an inkling into challenges ahead of the CBI programs in our sub-region. The first, Mr. Speaker, relates in our debate to the European Parliament in Strasbourg the first quarter in 2022 regarding visa-free travel to the European Union by citizens of countries with CBI programs. The debate underscored that CBI agents and intermediaries are neither transparent nor held accountable. Further, in this debate in the European Parliament, there was growing consensus about the need to ban golden passports. Mr. Speaker, there is also huge concern in the European Union about Russians accessing Dominican citizenship. The second development, Mr. Speaker, relates to the introduction in the United States Congress of draft legislation entitled No Travel for Traffickers Act in March 2022. This legislation includes a provision to direct the U.S. executive branch to cooperate with the United Kingdom and the European Union to eliminate Schengen visa-free travel for countries with CBI programs. Mr. Speaker, such developments are indeed serious threats to the future of the CBI program. Yet, this government has paid scant attention to them and has continued business as usual, eroding confidence in our CBI program, in the European Union, and the United Kingdom and the United States. We on this side of the House call on the government to heed the warning of the European Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States and address without delay all the deficiencies in the CBI program that are contributing to the growing lack of confidence in those countries. Mr. Speaker, clearly, all the due diligence actions which the Prime Minister mentioned in his address to the nation are not enough. Mr. Speaker, we welcome the Prime Minister's stated plan to engage the services of a European-based entity who shall come in to do a comprehensive review of our entire program and to advise us of the additional changes which we ought to make. Sadly, Mr. Speaker, it may be already too late. We must accept that the days of the CBI program, being the cash cow, are coming to an end. While CBI programs may continue in some form, the windfall of billions of dollars it produced will soon cease. Mr. Speaker, this year marks 22 years since this government embarked on an initiative to develop geothermal power generation in Dominica. Credit must be given to the late Prime Minister of Dominica, Honorable Pierre Charles, for his visionary outlook and foresight to develop our natural energy sources. At the 2002 United Nations World Summit on Sustainable Development in Johannesburg, South Africa, Pierre Charles laid out a vision for 100% renewable energy generation in Dominica with geothermal as the leading source. His vision was for a 10-year realization and the end of diesel generation for electricity in Dominica. Mr. Speaker, in his 2023-2024 budget address, the Honorable Minister of Finance, Dr. Irving McIntyre, acknowledged that geothermal energy development has been a long journey, but this government has remained committed to this project because we understand the long-term positive impact the fully commissioned geothermal plants will have on the cost of doing business in Dominica. Mr. Speaker, the government's geothermal energy objectives are indeed noble and in the national interest, but the burning question that arises is how much longer should the people of Dominica have to wait to see geothermal power generation and the associated drop in the price of electricity to Dominican consumers? Mr. Speaker, it is well known that Dominica has the most expensive price per kilowatt hour of electricity in the Caribbean. Lower electricity rates are what the Dominican people look forward to, and we hope that geothermal power will usher in that expectation. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Finance did give us hope as regards to geothermal power generation and a decline in the high price of electricity. He spoke about the remaining components for geothermal energy development, namely the construction of the power plant and the building of a new high-capacity transmission network with transmission lines that will be placed on the ground. What he did not say, Mr. Speaker, is what is the timeline for geothermal power generation to become a reality in Dominica. Mr. Speaker, at the UN Climate Change Conference in Paris, France in December 2015, the government of Dominica made a commitment to have 100% generation of electricity through renewable resources by 2030 and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 45%. That, Mr. Speaker, was 8 years ago. And now the clock is even ticking, given 7 years are remaining on honoring these important commitments. Mr. Speaker, in that period, Our dependence on diesel for 67% of our electric power continues to this day along with a high level of carbon emissions and with no end in sight. We have not paid much attention to energy efficiency, especially reduction of transmission lines losses. And we did very little development of solar and wind energy, and we placed all our focus for renewable energy on geothermal power. Mr. Speaker, it is in the national interest for the government to inform the nation of the cumulative financial outlay for geothermal energy to this day. Mr. Speaker, more than 15 years ago, two areas of the country were embarked for geothermal energy development, the Roseau Valley and Soufriere. Soufriere fell off the geothermal energy development radar, and no credible explanation has ever been given to the people of Dominica for the abrupt retreat and abandonment. Mr. Speaker, an agreement was signed in 2008 with West Indies Power Limited to develop geothermal energy in Soufriere, but they reneged on their obligations. In fact, the company promised that it would produce geothermal power in Soufriere area by 2010. This commitment never materialized. Mr. Speaker, our people have never been provided with an explanation as to why this geothermal energy venture in Soufriere collapsed. The history of geothermal development in Dominica will never be complete without our full understanding as to why Soufriere's geothermal resource was never fully developed by West Indies Power Limited. We know that millions of dollars were spent, but with no transparency, there has been suspicion and speculation. Mr. Speaker, we in the parliamentary opposition fully support renewable energy development as the only future for energy sustainability in Dominica. To enhance our status as a nature island of the Caribbean, we must hasten our efforts towards 100% generation of green energy. Mr. Speaker, the proposed 10-megawatt power plant in Loda is no doubt a step in the right direction, but we hasten to ask two questions. Firstly, will this plant fully produce the electric power currently generated by diesel? And secondly, will this plant replace diesel generation completely? Mr. Speaker, our goal as a nation must be to utilize all the natural energy sources towards becoming self-sufficient in energy and towards realization of a significant reduction in the price of electricity to Dominican consumers. Mr. Speaker, we are pleased that building a skilled human resource in geothermal engineering has been factored in the geothermal energy development plan. A cadre of geothermal engineers from Dominica will be pivotal to the sustainable management of geothermal energy generation in the medium to long term. Mr. Speaker, we concur that geothermal energy generation has great potential for economic diversification, attracting investments, and for exporting green energy to our neighbors. Prudent development of the geothermal energy endowment holds great promise for the future economic development of our beloved nature isle. Further, it must become abundantly clear to all Dominicans that geothermal energy generation is essential for Dominica to honor its intended national determined contribution to global climate change mitigation under the Paris Agreement and climate action aligned to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal 13, wherein our nation aims to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. Mr. Speaker, the majority of Dominicans were left aghast when the Minister of Finance, Dr. Evan McIntyre, in his budget address, lauded Dominicans' healthcare system. He said, and I quote, "There is no one who can dispute the fact that Dominicans' healthcare system is far better now than it has ever been." Close quote. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Finance is a former Minister of Health. He is also a medical doctor who has worked for many years in our healthcare system. Mr. Speaker, surely he ought to be aware of the dreadful state of our public healthcare system. Mr. Speaker, Most Dominicans at some point or another have heard about the horror stories and experiences at the Dominica China Friendship Hospital. It is indeed patently absurd for the administration to assert that Dominica has an effective and enviable health system. While the budget address of 2023-2024 may boast about new facilities and staff, what truly matters are health outcomes, not just the inputs. Despite claims that healthcare spending consumes a significant portion of the budget, the actual outcomes are appalling. Mr. Speaker, most Dominicans feel genuine fear for their lives when entering the Dominica-China Friendship Hospital due to attitudes of indifference, alleged professional negligence, lack of issue tracking and accountability systems, inadequate basic supplies, and numerous other problems. In fact, the leadership of our country appears to agree with this conclusion as they choose to seek medical care far away from our national hospital for themselves and their families. Mr. Speaker, the critical state of Dominica's healthcare system can be objectively demonstrated by looking at the infant mortality rates. Infant mortality rates are widely regarded as a leading indicator of the effectiveness and accessibility of healthcare services in a country. Unfortunately, the infant mortality rate in Dominica has been increasing steadily in recent years. Despite this alarming state of affairs, the budget makes no mention of any program or funding to address this issue. Similarly, cancer rates are increasing sharply, yet the budget fails to include any program to tackle this escalating health crisis. Mr. Speaker, we are fortunate to have access to objective external data that can shed light on the issue of infant mortality, but unfortunately, many metrics of health outcomes in Dominica remain unknown. Metrics such as mortality rates, medical accident rates, timely care rates, and patient services ratings are essential indicators of the healthcare system's performance. However, based on the perception of many citizens, these metrics are highly likely to be unacceptable, possibly even at an alarming levels. Mr. Speaker, despite the lack of data or focus on the outcomes, the government boasted during the budget presentation that our healthcare system is comparable to that of developed nations. Such claims, Mr. Speaker, without concrete evidence, may be met with disbelief considering the concerns and experiences shared by Dominicans. Mr. Speaker, transparency and accurate data are crucial for understanding the true state of the healthcare system and making informed decisions for improvement. However, there are no specific budgetary allocations to implement or improve these monitoring and accountability systems. Mr. Speaker, the government's claim on being a champion in education are overshadowed by its focus on showcasing spending on inputs and construction rather than more critical aspects of education outcomes. Mr. Speaker, education is about nurturing well-trained, productive, and socially responsible citizens, not merely increasing the number of students in schools or building more school structures. Mr. Speaker, where are the budgetary allocations for testing students with disabilities? Where are the plans and funding for special education classes or remedial summer school programs? Mr. Speaker, the government talks about increased funding for teacher training, but fails to realize that the biggest obstacle for teachers is having students who are badly underprepared for secondary school. Likewise, the government congratulates itself on providing university scholarships, but these scholarships lack strategic planning for the future or proactive training of the country's human resource to meet the country's actual needs. Moreover, Mr. Speaker, the administration's practice of awarding scholarships, partly based on political affiliation, leaves much of our country's best human capital sidelined, hindering the overall progress and development of the nation. Mr. Speaker, it would appear that this government has something against the Salisbury, Coolibistry, and Monrachet constituency. Mr. Speaker, the most potent weapon of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. I make this statement because it is evident that we in the Salisbury, Coolibistry, and the Monrachet constituency are being oppressed by this current administration. Mr. Speaker, I begin with the community of Coolibistry. On August 27, 2000,
What would be the relevance of bringing in this statement in the budget? I mean, which line item are you referring to? And I wanted to point out to you that you were imputing improper motive when you said that scholarships or assistance given to people based on a political basis, but I didn't want to affect your flow. So I would just remind you that that was imputing motive and ask you at the same time to withdraw it.
withdrawn.
Nice. Now, in regards to relevance, I don't want to affect your flow, so move quick. What is the relevance of what you're going to say there? Because you already start talking
In terms
about
of housing, Mr. Speaker, roads.
No, but you already said that the government have a problem with Salisbury people, but it's not relating to the budget.
Withdrawn, Mr. Speaker.
So let's proceed, but be guided by that statement I made there. Relevance.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I begin with the community of Coolibistry. On August 27, 2015, this community was severely impacted by Tropical Storm Erica. This resulted in extensive damage to homes and displacement of residents. Thereafter, this community was declared as a disaster area. It's nearly 8 years since the passage of Tropical Storm Erica, and the people of Coolibistry feel abandoned by this current administration. Still reeling from the huge losses they suffered during Tropical Storm Erica, the same constituency was also impacted by Hurricane Maria. To date, nothing has been done to assist the residents. Mr. Speaker, I listen to the residents and their cries for help almost on a daily basis. Just imagine living in fear every time it rains. Most of the families are unable to relocate because of financial constraints. Many of the other communities that were also declared as disaster areas have already gotten keys for homes, which I am very elated for the recipients, except for Coolibistry. Why, Mr. Speaker? Why? Why is it? Mr. Speaker, apart from the fact that the residents need homes, the government also needs to construct a river wall and a bridge. The bridge over the river was also compromised. The bridge, it hurts to see how a government who claims to love and is considered about the livelihoods and concerned about the livelihoods and safety of the citizens of the Commonwealth of Dominica can have the residents of Coolibistry living in this nightmare. In the budget address, we heard of 344 homes that are going to be built in this fiscal year. The Minister of Finance also made mention of the various communities where houses will be erected. I want to remind this government that Coolibistry also is part of Dominica. Mr. Speaker, I highlighted the plight of the people of Monrachet in the first meeting in Parliament in February. It has been 23 years since an estimate was done on a back road for this community. Mr. Speaker, 23 years is an extremely long time to have the people waiting, as there is only one way which serves both entrance and exit to this community. When will the government deliver on the back road for the people of Monrachet? Mr. Speaker, for decades, Salisbury has been and still is one of the most progressive and productive communities, but we also have urgent need for requiring adequate allocation of public funds. In agriculture, we need feeder roads development in the heights of Salisbury, Guomon, Petit Makushri, to name a few. We have been through our darkest times under the administration for our feeder roads. To this date, we still have not seen any sign of work being started on any of these feeder roads. We need a food processing and a packaging facility to export of our produce. We need more shipping access to regional and agricultural markets. Mr. Speaker, if this government is indeed serious about increasing revenue from agriculture from $274 million in 2022 to $700 million by 2030, then it needs to pay greater attention to the feeder roads in Salisbury. In sports and recreation, we need the government to work with the Village Council in Salisbury to develop the Salisbury playing field. The Salisbury basketball hardcourt also needs to be repaired and upgraded. In health, Mr. Speaker, need I say that we are in need of a bigger and more upgraded health facility. With the growing population in this community, the health team suffers many challenges. These challenges include inadequate space at the facility. There is no kitchenette, limited essential supplies for work. They need proper beds, suction machine, nebulizer machines, crepe bandages, just to name a few. Mr. Speaker, in the early part of my address this morning, I spoke about storm clouds hovering over the Dominican economy. I know many Dominicans had been hoping that this year's budget would provide some relief, but alas, their hopes have been firmly dashed. The measures in this budget will not reverse the economic decline, which has been evident for some time. The initiatives contained in this budget fail to address the almost insurmountable economic challenges that the country faces. Over the last several years, the government has relied on the CBI program to finance its housing program and hotel construction to meet much of its operating expenses. With the entire CBI program facing an uncertain future in light of the British government's visa imposition on Dominicans and the certainty that the European Union will pursue similar action, can the Dominican economy survive a potential sharp drop in revenues from CBI? How realistic is it that the international airport will ever be completed given that the CBI is intended to finance it? Total debt service for this fiscal year is projected to be over $100 million. The debt to GDP ratio is close to 100%. The public sector wage bill is projected to increase by an additional $9 million in this fiscal year. The government's expected revenue projections, especially from the CBI program for this fiscal year, are totally unrealistic and unachievable. Mr. Speaker, the omens of our economy do not look good. Indeed, the prognosis is bad, very bad. We are about to experience a further drop in living standards, mass unemployment, rising poverty, and a declining population. Mr. Speaker, this government speaks of exogenous shocks and the war in Ukraine as possible reasons for some of our economic problems. Yes, the world is interconnected and we are not immune from international events. But the reality is that the crisis we in is almost entirely homegrown. Just a few months ago, the Prime Minister told us about the meeting with the Americans and the robust nature of the due diligence process of the CBI program. For years, several countries in the region, namely Antigua, St. Kitts and Nevis, and Dominica, have relied heavily on revenues from CBI programs to sustain their economies. The Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Dr. Ralph Gonsalves, has always been opposed to the CBI in principle. Mr. Speaker, this is what Dr. Ralph Gonsalves had to say about the CBI programs in the Caribbean in light of the British government's decision on visa requirements. And I quote, "Those who didn't see it and wanted to base their economic strategy on it, they now get their comeuppance. I said this thing is not sustainable. You cannot base your economic development and finance your budget on that," end quote. Mr. Speaker, as the economic crisis in Dominica deepens, the Dominicans need to start learning about terms like inflation, stagflation, fiscal gap, debt overhang, and stabilization levy. Harder times are ahead, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, my presentations here today would not be complete without concluding on a subject of electoral reform. As explained earlier in my address, the report of Sir Dennis Byron is deficient in several aspects. We in the parliamentary opposition are prepared to work with all interested parties and organizations under the auspices of the Electoral Commission to push for common consensus on electoral reform. It cannot be right that the Prime Minister, who has a vested interest in the eventual outcome of the revised electoral laws, should lead any consultation exercise on electoral reform in Dominica. Mr. Speaker, I am not suggesting the entire Byron report should be discarded, but several of his proposals we oppose on principle and will not compromise on.
Member, are you aware of the rule of tedious repetition?
No, no,
So,
Mr. Speaker.
if you are not going to stay long on it, you would complete. But if you are going to stay long on the electoral reform, you would have to proceed on another section because tedious repetition. Because you spent about maybe 15 minutes on electoral reform with the same statements. So proceed.
Mr. Speaker, I am convinced that a radical overhaul in our electoral system and strict rules in place of campaign financing, it would be virtually impossible for the Labour Party to continue winning elections in Dominica. Mr. Speaker, in closing, I return to the budget of 2023-2024. It's indeed astonishing that this government believes it can raise more money from CBI this year than last year in spite of recent developments. Mr. Speaker, this budget fails to deliver on generating broad-based growth. It fails to state what it intends to do to lessen the crippling impact on the population of high and rising food prices. It fails to map out a clear and coherent economic strategy now that we know that the CBI's programs days as a major revenue source are almost over. Mr. Speaker, this is another budget of soundbites and fluff, devoid of clear pathways to get our country out of the rut it is in. Mr. Speaker, we on this side of the House, in all seriousness, cannot support this budget. Thank you.